All right, and I think we have everybody signed in. So welcome everybody to our webinar series. My name is Michelle Legault and I'm the CSLA and LACF Executive Director, and I'm pleased to be your host today. If you don't already know, we're here to hear Ryan Coates speaking about Region 40, a national park for the Anthropocene Epoch. And I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I would ask you to place your feet on the ground and breathe the air at your location. We acknowledge that we're gathering today from coast to coast to coast on the lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their governments. We acknowledge that the head office of the CSLA is in unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, and the head office of AALA is in Treaty 6, Métis Region 4. Thank you. So welcome to our Congress webinar series, where we have since September been featuring speakers who were scheduled to speak at the canceled June 2020 event in Calgary. As you may recall, the CSLA had partnered with the Alberta Association of Landscape Architects for a Congress. And so that's why we are jointly bringing you this series and featuring all of those great presentations that we were unable to screen in June. We're going to proceed with the presentation, and I would encourage you to ask questions via the chat box or even the Q&A feature, whichever you prefer. I'll be monitoring both. And there will be some time at the end for the discussion after Ryan's presentation. I should note that the recording, we're recording this session, and it will be available on YouTube via our website shortly after. So you're participating today in a Zoom webinar, and that means that you can only see the speakers and you don't see all the other participants. However, you can chat with them. You can, just like you do through a regular Zoom platform. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker today, Ryan Coates. Ryan holds a master's degree in landscape architecture and a bachelor's in environmental design from the University of Manitoba. He was named a University Olmsted Scholar in 2017. He's currently a sessional instructor at the University of Manitoba, and his research is concerned with how anthropogenic landscapes become part of societal heritage through their incorporation into envirocultural systems, such as Parks Canada. Previously, Ryan has worked and designed for Parks Canada in Riding Mountain National Park, and he continues to work and design landscapes that consider how we relate to a changing planet, as well as how we have changed it. So thank you very much, Ryan, and I'll pass it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. And I'm audible right now? Great, okay. And everyone can see.
Perfect, Ryan, go ahead.
Yes?
Yes.
Great, okay. Okay, so thank you so much, everybody, for spending a bit of time with me this afternoon. I'll just get into it. So landscapes, whether safeguarded or squandered, reveal a society's values. Landscapes are always more than they appear to be. More than their former content, they are also repositories of imagination, reflections of ethics, and representations of ideal relationships to the environment. I think all of us here today carry a landscape within us that we wander back to and find solace in. I think the memory of and care for these places are vital to how we construct our relationships to the world and to each other. As Canadians, we appreciate the beauty of the natural environment and the richness of our history. These elements contribute to an understanding and collective sense of Canada's national identity, as well as a shared sense of pride. They unify us as a people, yet express our national diversity. Canadians share this heritage with each other and welcome others to value, respect, and learn about it. They are national symbols, yet can be located in virtually any part of the country, urban, rural, and remote. They are also tangible links not only with the past and the present, but with the future. This is part of the guiding principles and operational policies of Parks Canada. I think, of course, to define what is so important about these places, I think it's useful to start here before we start to jump into a little bit of a challenge of what that might mean moving forward. So today is May 13th, 2021. I'm in Winnipeg, and it's currently a rather pleasant day. It's 21 degrees Celsius outside. And yeah, from my window, it looks like we might finally be getting a bit of desperately needed rain to alleviate some drought conditions that are occurring here. It's also 418.42 parts per million atmospheric carbon today, or at least on May 21st, or sorry, May 11th it was. I think this is a very important datum to know and to, I think, embed into the way that we think about our day-to-day lives, something we really need to reckon with. You know, last year when this presentation was supposed to happen, that number was 416.43 parts per million. And if you've been aware of the news, the recent news, so a couple of weeks ago, April 5th, I guess a month ago actually now, the atmospheric carbon levels spiked over 420 parts per million, which is the first time that's happened in recorded history. This is a really significant issue, right? As we head towards global doubling of atmospheric carbon from when we really started being concerned about this type of number in the kind of in the late 1950s. So from 300 to 600 were projected to get there, by around 2080. This is a really important threshold because it's related to how the world is going to change, how the planet is going to be able to accommodate and withstand that sort of rapid amount of change in the atmosphere. This is tied to the representative concentration pathway 8.5. This is correlated to 600 parts per million. It is the high emission business as usual scenario, the one that we are kind of unfortunately headed down at the moment. We have to move much quicker than we currently are, and we are seeing the effects at our doorstep more vividly each day. We know that regardless of which direction we ultimately choose to move, the effects of these choices we have made in the past are revealing themselves with greater and increasing severity and frequency in local conditions. So more fires in the dry west, more flooding along the coast, and drought in the prairies. But also the emergence of more stochastic events such as the polar vortex depicted here that spilled all the way down to Texas, causing myriad infrastructural, ecological, and economic issues in its wake. Quite recently, this was also another consequence that we're starting to see. The new normals are being released, so Canada's is anticipated to be released in the next number of months. But I would assume that we're going to see something quite similar as the idea of what the normal is from 1990 to 2010, as opposed from 1980 to 2000, is going to be indicating a very similar thing here of about a half degree warmer across the country. It is into this world that the practice of landscape architecture must contend, and the world I am and we are all inheriting will be engaged in the accommodation of novel and migrating ecologies, new socio-political relationships, and dynamic and fluid cultural relationships. These are all encompassed in the ways that we construct the built world and how we must seek responses centered around greater attention to sustainability, justness, and beauty. In Canada, what's this consequence going to look like? Well, based on models from, this is actually models from the 1980s, but this sort of global doubling is anticipated to show a very, very different Canadian landscape. You'll notice here the boreal forest becomes disconnected, the Arctic regions become much smaller, and there's a much greater increase in the sort of arid types of landscapes, temperate grasslands, and things like that that will exist in the kind of prairie regions. We're seeing very kind of rapid changes starting to occur. These are the kinds of transitional conditions we have to think about. So in the condition of ecological systems or sort of keystone species within our typical forest ecologies, looking at how these are going to migrate. And typically the range is moving faster than the species can move itself across the continent. Zooming into where I will be talking about in a bit, Fort McMurray, we can see here the way that the species diversity is projected to shift quite significantly over the next 50 or so years. On top of this, there's also a need to consider where and how those next park spaces can be selected. If Canada were to adopt the 30 by 30, so 30% protected area by 2030 goal that is being advanced in places like the US and abroad, we have quite a ways to go. At the end of 2019, only 12.1% of terrestrial area and 13.8% of marine territory was conserved. So we have, more than halfway to go on each of these fronts. Parks Canada has a system plan that is based on representativeness, which I will get into shortly. And other methods include analysis such as this one, based on ecosystem services, here looking at carbon sequestration, freshwater access and supply, and nature-based recreation as the kind of representative conditions in their analysis of broad-scale possibilities for selecting new park spaces or conservation spaces. But I think that there's a critique here that we could kind of think about is foregrounding of all of these services around their instrumental value or their value for humans. What of their intrinsic value? Should not a landscape, a plant community, or a collection of ecosystems be protected for their own sake, as protecting the survival of relationships? And I think, how do we do this? How do we start to move towards, not just thinking about these species migrations, but the relationships that will change because of these sort of landscape changes that are occurring? How do we relate as a society to this condition? How do we build more equitable, just, and sustainable relationships with the land and with each other? I think we do this through telling ourselves stories. And I think that landscape architecture has a vast repository of narratives that we engage with, both from within the profession and in partnership with others. Because this particularly large story is needing to be told, one that spans the continent, I believe it demands that we try to tell it with the largest tool we have for shaping environmental narratives. Parks Canada is one of the most important ways Canada sees itself and promotes itself as a country of bountiful nature and values centered around sustainability and green economics. We tell ourselves these stories through the parks themselves, right? These are the containers for that narrative. These are the way that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And it's important to note that this has been a shifting kind of relationship, moving from a preservation kind of ethic into a conservation ethic, and now I think moving towards something else. And what else? What is that else going to be? It's especially important because I think the parks do a wonderful job of telling us about how important our Canadian landscapes are, but I think they also only tell us a half truth. And in the Anthropocene, we need to start being more honest with ourselves. First, these spaces are not Canadian by any means. They are in fact long established and inhabited, and still to this day Indigenous homelands, with thousands of years of stories before our own settler ones came to crowd them out. And second, if there is a true Canadian landscape, this might be a bit more of an accurate depiction. This is just as true a landscape, just as much a part of our heritage as Banff or Nahanni or Riding Mountain is. And it is just as critical to the way we discuss and possibly work through our environmental legacy towards a better environmental future. Back to this paper by Mitchell et al. An important reflection out of the paper remarked on the collision of priorities that exist in the Canadian South between land use for ecological services and for resource extraction, whether that exists as urbanism, agriculture, forestry, or mineral and oil and gas extraction. This is of course not a new conflict. It is a foundational condition of Canada and of Parks Canada as well. And it is a relationship that has come to define the Anthropocene condition. I think best put here by environmental law scholar and author Jedediah Purdy, where our energy economy, our transport economy, our food economy shape our ecology. In a sense, they are our ecology just as much as rivers and forests are. And this has been put in similarly, kind of maybe less poetic terms, but it's sort of the kind of the national standard for how we promote ourselves economically as well, right? The environment and the economy go together like paddles and canoes. They go hand in hand. This has been the primary way of advancing our sort of our energy goals as well as our ecological goals at the federal level. Canada is actually a series of landscapes. Of course, we know this. Colonial sites of extraction seen here are mining and timber leases, infrastructures, including pipelines, rail corridors, and road systems that bound the lands converted to agriculture by the Dominion Land Act, and pollution sites that, taken together, do almost as good a job of revealing the territory as a geologic, watercourse, or administrative boundary map can. These landscapes have a problematic legacy of treating the post-extractive state as an externality, often becoming the responsibility of the state to address their rehabilitation. So rather than thinking about these as a collision of priorities, I propose that these extraction landscapes and their restoration should become part of the purview of Parks Canada's responsibility in the development and communication of an environmental narrative. It is a significant front for opportunity to create more protected space and to challenge the nature of what that nature might need. So how do we go about doing this? I think it starts with looking at what Parks Canada does already and how it organizes itself internally in the ways that it works to select representative spaces for our national framework, and that is done through the system plan. And so currently there are 39 representative areas in the system plan. There are a number that have yet to be represented by a park, and there are a number that have multiple parks representing them. My proposal here is to incorporate a 40th region, the Anthropocene region. Typically, these in the system plan, these parks are identified and described through this type of template. So each region gets its own kind of two-page layout in the document and is identified primarily through features of the land, features of vegetation, features of wildlife, and the status of what is happening with respect to preserving spaces as national parks. You can see here that there are a number of spaces that are waiting representation and a number that have kind of parks that overlap on multiple boundaries, multiple parks within a single boundary, and so forth. And so I'm proposing here that those landscapes of extraction are actually going to be very important spaces to incorporate into this overall condition and system. So Region 40 represents itself through not necessarily any specific identifier of the landscape it's in, but rather the absences that it creates. And so this allows for a way to increase the flexibility of the framework, invest sort of goals of adaptation into the system plan, and I think have a little bit more dexterity in the way that we might achieve a more sort of adaptability framework into the Parks Canada narrative. In order to evaluate this idea and sort of explore it further, I went to look at probably the most prominent extractive landscape in the Canadian context, the oil sands around Fort McMurray, as a potential representative park space. Of course, before it was Fort McMurray, and still, though it is Fort McMurray, this is traditional homelands of Dene, Cree, Big Stone Cree, Woodland Cree, Beaver, Métis Nation, and Beaver Lake Cree people. It is also a landscape that is not atypical to the rest of the province of Alberta. You can see here in the moving image, the existence of well pads by decade. So we can see sort of that legacy of extraction has expanded across the province for a very long time. And this is sort of a general image of what that landscape is typically composed of. Zooming in a bit closer again to the Fort McMurray area, we can see here the level of extraction in red. So this is all kind of seismic cut lines, well pads, and other extraction sites that pockmark the landscape and start to take on the scale of, something like a forest fire, which you can see in gray. That sort of relationship is I think, an interesting one to parse. We can also evaluate this space along the lines of what sort of conflicts are starting to emerge. So if we think about ecosystem services and fresh water, well, what happens when a pipeline crosses any sort of watershed, be that a creek or a river or a lake? Where are those conflicts? Where are those potential conflicts in blue? And where are ones that have occurred in the varying black circles? And then finally, what does this do to the vegetative state? It fragments it significantly. So the level of intactness that occurs in this landscape is quite, it's been quite impacted, and that impact has a significant effect on caribou populations, for instance. So you can see here in the red, those are the typical range extents for the caribou populations in the area, and they have quite a sensitivity to this type of landscape fragmentation. So thinking about all of these things and then moving into the scale of a park, I zoomed into a more park scale, 2,500 square kilometers just south of Fort McMurray. And beginning with sort of being explicit about what the extractive landscape and its repair as a directive for the park narrative and composition would mean. And this involves having to really question the idea of wilderness as a goal for nature and starting to really think about what it means to have a human relationship in that landscape, be a bit more explicit. Because all of these changes are happening so rapidly, these sort of climate conditions causing very massive shifts in sort of species composition, in order to ensure the stability of these ecosystems, we're going to actually have to be much more active in the way that they transition. It's going to be a very sort of human endeavor to keep these places as natural as possible. And so this demands thinking a little bit more creatively about what the zoning plan currently does in Parks Canada's framework. So another thing to think about here is Zone 1 particularly is what I'm going to talk about, the idea of special preservation, which is currently the current sort of paradigm in the zoning model. In 2014, Amy Feed in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism discovered a number of concerns amongst Parks Canada staff regarding the zoning plan, including the layering of dated zoning policies below new management planning policies, and a zoning system that may be spatially much too coarse and may not offer the flexibility required for ecosystem-based management or adaptive management practices, or may otherwise misalign with these new approaches. Those interviewed expressed a desire to see the zoning management system incorporate more, quote, flexibility or adaptability of strategic level zoning by introducing temporal or seasonal zoning, and that incorporating this flexibility, temporal or otherwise, should be unambiguously available throughout the system for unique circumstances, proposed uses, or activities. It became evident that in most cases, park zoning does not set specific objectives towards a desired future state or a vision of a site or ecosystem, but simply preserves the current state or status quo conditions. Land use decisions in older parks predated the zoning system, and zoning was applied after certain human uses and development patterns had been established. Inevitably, such a zoning situation is predominantly reflective of historic land use rather than a concern for ecological or cultural values. So this distinction to consider the future state of parks in zoning management planning reflects the inherent historicism of the ecological integrity framework Parks Canada operates within, and will limit the ability for the organization to address Anthropocene changes that all the parks across the regions 1 through 39 and 40 present and future will experience. So I propose here that Zone 1A, which is a very significant and very activated piece of the puzzle in terms of protecting what is currently in a park, can be augmented by a secondary level. So a 1A and a 1B, these should be co-equal. So special preservation and special reclamation. So in special reclamation zones, specific areas or features which deserve special reclamation because their restoration is critical to reconnecting and repairing degraded natural features. These spaces will be celebrated and publicly accessible to showcase the science and processes required to establish the integrity of that landscape. The evolution of the landscape under serious climate change scenarios is a key consideration. What this can start to look like is a much more sort of public awareness of how landscapes at the broad scale are being sort of forced to change, and how humans will need to be at the forefront of assisting that change so that we don't end up with ecosystems on life support. Coming back to the idea of how these range shifts are occurring, this can be implemented through thinking about various types of assisted migration. So my proposal here seeks to combine all three of these types of methods. So moving from the lower risk of moving a population within its current range to the higher risk of moving species from outside of the range that are anticipated to become endemic in that area. This is done by kind of repurposing the well pad condition. So this is a 1 hectare type of space that pockmarks the entire area and of course all of Alberta, and starting to really think about the types of species that are anticipated to move in there, as well as the types of species that are already endemic to that area, and letting them kind of coexist. And these then become spaces of access to the public. They become didactic landscapes that start to tell us a little bit more about how well we are doing or how poorly we may be doing in the transition of these landscapes, as well as in the fight to curb our carbon emissions. And so this might look like a kind of mosaic plantation, multiple hectares, kind of checkerboarded across the region, using multiple species, and as I was saying, become didactic landscapes that tell us either if we have avoided that RCP 8.5 type of scenario and the current kind of boreal condition of the forest remains, or if we end up in that kind of 8.5 scenario and we end up in a much more kind of temperate deciduous forest condition. So yeah, that's about all I'm wanting to kind of talk about today. But I think the goal here is to, and the challenge is really to think about, you know, how do we tell stories to ourselves? What is the role of Parks Canada to kind of help advance this type of story, which is happening as we speak? And how do we, as members of the community of landscape architecture, help to ensure that that story is told in a way that provides some hope, provides some reality though as well to the broader public. And lastly, this is an ongoing flag I want to fly, and still has not. I'm waiting the day when this letter is maybe a little more positive than the last time I tried. But thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I like that you ended on a note that shows your persistence. So So we really appreciate your presentation today. And with all of the attendees assembled here, we have some time now to open to questions. So please, ask your questions through the chat function or the Q&A. Ryan will stay on for a few minutes and I can help relay his questions. So we had a large group joining us today. At one point, we were 120 participants, and as the questions come in, I just want to echo the ALA, and we want to thank all of the presenters in this webinar series in 2020 and 2021. We had great attendance. I calculated quickly that probably over 1,000 people logged into these webinars this year. So that's really a fantastic opportunity to hear people, and we probably wouldn't have had 1,000 people attend the Congress, but there we go. So again, thank you very much, Ryan, and have a few questions coming in here. So Ian Gray asks, he says, excellent presentation. Recognizing the active role of humans with non-humans, what are your thoughts on the role of regeneration versus intentional human managed restoration in PCA landscapes, I'm assuming?
I'm assuming PCA
lands, period.
Not PCA. Parks Canada, who else might you approach to gain momentum? Oh, yeah, I think Parks Canada lands. Okay. Yeah, I think that the thing I came to kind of see, and in my time working actually in the Riding Mountain Field Unit, was this sort of disparity a little bit between, I think one thing that we kind of end up understanding in landscape architecture education is like the inherent constructedness of nature, that we are like always kind of involved in creating it, whether that is through sort of actively intervening or through the way that we sort of frame a relationship. Those are all sort of instances of intentional human management, but that in some cases there's less. I got a lot of pushback from just kind of thinking about these things out loud from some of my colleagues, because there is a little bit more of that kind of deferring to the idea of like wilderness and this sort of untrammeled kind of condition as being somehow more true than the human intervened, when in fact to create a sort of untrammeled space is to actually intervene. So I think I think that's the trick, the big narrative kind of trick that is required. The task is to, I think, expand the idea of what it means to take care of something, and that to leave it alone is certainly a viable option. But as we can see, the way that these things are changing, the way that these systems are shifting and moving, it's going to require humans to have a lot more, to admit to themselves, I think, a lot more that they're going to be responsible for helping that along. Yeah, to the other question here of like, who else might I approach? I mean, I've really tried to frame this as a national condition. I mean, certainly there are the provincial park bodies and things like that I think this would also be a worthwhile conversation to have at that level as well. But I think that there's something about having it at the national level that I think is quite important.
And so we have a few other questions as well. Karen England asks, where did you find measurements for atmospheric carbon in your region?
So the atmospheric carbon measurements I get from the Mauna Loa Observatory. So the Keeling reading, that's a global, like the atmospheric number is a global number. So, but it has local consequences, of course. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to indicate there in the early part of this lecture is, the increasing in atmospheric carbon is a global phenomenon, a global problem, but it's going to have direct situations, direct impacts on our local habitats and local ecologies. So it's not a local number, but it has local impacts.
Great. And we have also a question by Karen. What role do you see for First Nations in protecting 30% by 2030?
And then there's also the question from Kendra, which I think is similarly
Is very similar as well.
framed, yes. Which says you identify First Nations, but do not address how this work could contribute to the decolonization of extractive industry. Instead, this leans towards continued control and settlement of land. What role could an Anthropocene National Park play in reconciliation and Indigenous sovereignty? Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree that the lens that I've chosen here does shy away a little bit from that conversation, which is an extremely important one to be having. I think Parks Canada is doing some of that work a lot more, taking it a lot more seriously in recent recent years. So I think this is happening more in the north, though. I think you know, when you see Kausuituk National Park and Teluru Tiup Imanga National Marine Conservation Areas, these are being proposed and developed and managed in relationship with the Inuit communities around those parks. So this kind of movement to co-management, I think, is really, I think is really the future for how also all the southern parks need to be kind of operating. Yeah, I think that, of course, the issue of extraction is, of course, inherently a colonial issue, and so I think the idea of how do you kind of make that reparation on land is also a question of how do you make that reparation with people of that land. And I think, you know, as much as Parks Canada has a very kind of troubled history, to put it politely, with Indigenous communities, I think there is a desire in the organization to make amends for that, and I think that this type of park could be a type that could be an interesting way to where goals are totally aligned. I think in terms of reclaiming land and restoring integrity to land, I think that could be a really strong potential to advance cause between nations.
We also have a question here from Chris Grosset, who says, the Parks Canada zoning approach, as you described it, is also applied at the provincial and territorial level as a management tool. In your research, did you find examples of jurisdictions, national or other, that are using zoning in other ways or innovative ways?
I can't say that I did see anything like that in the course of my research, but I would love to see. I would love if there are examples, Chris, that you have. I would absolutely love to see them.
And Ivy Smith asks, do you have a website that displays the project or your ideas?
I should probably get on that. I don't.
Great. Well, if we have a few minutes left, if anybody has any other questions, certainly this presentation will be available on the CSLA's website. So there's a place for you to start, Ryan. And Ryan, if there's any other documentation that you'd like to put alongside that, we'd be happy to do that for you. I think, I have one other question that came in here from Karen, who says, are there any people within Parks Canada who'd be willing to discuss this, perhaps not officially? And did you discuss the proposal with historic sites?
So I chose to specifically look at the parks section of Parks Canada and not the historical sites section of Parks Canada. So my research intentionally tried to stay thinking about the landscape scale rather than kind of historical site scale of conditions. I think there's people willing. There are, as much as I did have some issues with talking about it, I did also find some, quite open and interested ears as well. So I think there's definitely people in the organization that are interested in the idea.
Great. And we have another question by Jamie, who asks, do you think it is integral for this ideological shift to be made specifically within the national park system? Parks Canada is also responsible for national historic sites. Though these are focused on the past rather than the future, it illustrates that anthropogenic influences are considered when placing value on Canadian landscapes. Perhaps Parks Canada would be more receptive to your ideas if proposed more parallel to national parks? ?
I think, yeah, I think what I'm ultimately trying to kind of poke at here is, what is the ideology of Parks Canada currently, and how does it need to respond to the fact that the idea of stable nature is fully gone, and the idea and that the parks have really based themselves around that idea of stable nature, that like Banff was always Banff and will always be Banff kind of thing. It'll always look the way it looks right now, which is just fundamentally impossible, fundamentally, not true at this stage, given the realities of climate change. So this is a conversation that has to happen within every single park that is established already in regions 1 through 39. I'm sort of thinking that by engaging these kind of anthropogenic, like explicitly anthropogenic landscapes, it allows that conversation to happen maybe a little easier, because it is so obvious and inherent to those places that it's requiring human intervention. And that might be able to then trickle down to the more sort of parks based on the naturalistic kind of principle, to have that conversation a bit easier.
Great. And you can confirm this, Ron, but Marcella mentioned that the research can be viewed at the University of Manitoba MSpace in the library.
Yes, thank you for the reminder. It can indeed be found at MSpace.
Thanks for that, Marcella.
Yeah.
That's great. Just reviewing the chat here, we have a few comments. Really interesting and a great way to push landscape architecture profession in the right direction. So some encouragement there. And I think we have time for one more question from, so we have two questions here, one from our newly minted president, Carolyn Woodland. Great presentation, Ryan, and you are right to challenge the standard Parks Canada ideology. Look into the Rouge Park that Parks Canada recently took over, but had difficulty rationalizing restoration in the urban context and changes in how they value their measurement of ecological integrity. And Barbara also asks similarly, any thoughts on how Parks Canada views the Rouge National Urban Park in Toronto?
I think the Rouge Park is a very interesting precedent, especially in relationship to, to go even a little further back to the Downsview competition, which was also had been kind of originally proposed to be kind of a federal park. And the vastly different ways that those two spaces ended up being articulated. The Downsview competition did actually kind of engage with a lot of these kind of thoughts in a much earlier format, but ultimately was, I think, maybe a bit too much of a challenge to the kind of the paradigm of the naturalism. And so I think Rouge is interesting in that it's trying to negotiate that a little, but it has to kind of stick to some of those naturalistic tendencies in the way that it's kind of being established and being managed. But yeah, I think there's Thank you for the question, Carolyn. I think Rouge is a very interesting precedent to continue to engage, and it would be interesting to see how what can be learned from that one can be extended into parks that don't have such a urban adjacency attached to them.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for an interesting presentation. And on behalf of the Alberta Association of Landscape Architects and the CSLA, we really want to thank you for taking the time to present this. And sorry you couldn't do it in person at the Congress, but it seems to be a theme this year, the video conference. So thank you very much. If you have any more questions, you can either send them directly to Ryan if you know his email address, or to me, and I'd be happy to forward them on. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and we really appreciate your attendance. Merci beaucoup tout le monde, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.